It's lovely to see so many people here today. I'm Sarah Young. This is the SSEES Russian Studies Research Seminar, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome today Dr Andrea Gullotta, who is a lecturer in Russian at the University of Glasgow in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Glasgow. Dr. Gullotta's research is very close to my heart, which is one of the reasons I invited him, as he is a specialist on the literature and culture of the Gulag. And I think, as we all know, there are huge numbers of historians of the Gulag. Somebody's got a mic on. Can you Thomas? Thank you very much. Lots of historians of the Gulag, but very few researchers focus specifically on its literature, despite this being a really enormous and very important area of Russian culture. That has had a huge impact, I think it's fair to say, over the last, getting on for 100 years now. A major focus of Andrea's research has been on the culture of the labour camps of the Solovki Islands on the White Sea, and which has acted as a sort of testing ground. Sorry about this. We've got people. Can people mute themselves? Thomas, can I mute? I don't.
I'm doing it, Sarah. It's okay.
Thank you. I'm not actually on this as a host, I don't think. Sorry, I'm getting lost in this. So yeah, the Solovki Islands in the White Sea in the north of Russia, which actually was as a sort of testing ground for the Gulag more broadly as it developed in the late 1920s and the early 30s. And Andrea has curated a really fascinating online exhibition for the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow on the culture of the Gulag. And I will, when I've stopped speaking, I will pop the URL in the chat so that you can have a look at that. His book as well is also on the literature and culture of Solovki, Intellectual Life and Literature of Solovki, 1923 to 1930, the Paris of the Northern concentration camps. And this is an absolutely groundbreaking study of Solovki in this period, looking at its literature and culture. But it is also a sort of a very well-grounded historical work as well. And this is the subject that he's going to be talking about this evening, relating particularly to the idea of Solovki Gulag literature. So I'm very excited to listen to his talk, and I'm sure you are all as well. So I'll stop speaking now, and I'll ask Andrea to begin.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for your lovely and very kind words. It is great to have your appreciation, and thank you, of course, for inviting me. This is the first of a few meetings I will have in the next few weeks that will take me from London to Paris to Cape Town, all from my house. The wonders of COVID and of the pandemic, but it is still a wonderful experience and a wonderful possibility to expose my research and to hear the opinion of the audience. And I'm really impressed to see so many people. So thank you a lot. And thank you also for mentioning the exhibition. I wasn't decided with them to make a talk about the exhibition or the book, but since they're very related, and since you're a specialist in literature in particular, I thought it was better to start from the book. So I will share a PowerPoint, so you don't have to see my face the whole time, and let's hope that none of the cats or the baby will get in the middle, but it may happen, so I'm just warning you. So, it seems like I can't share the screen anymore. Could you allow me to? And this is, I've been teaching, I think, as many people here online throughout the semester. This happens all the time. There you go. I can now. Thank you very much. Okay, I wonder if everybody can see the PowerPoint. I imagine so. If not, tell me. Right, okay, so the title is Solovki Gulag literature, which is a term I use throughout my my book. And the second part of the title, Towards a New Understanding of Gulag Literature, is a hope. It's been a pleasure to work on this, because this book, I've worked on this book for about 8 years, and then it has been published 2 years ago. And after that, to be honest, I've been doing other things. So preparing for this talk was a great journey in what I have done, and it made me also consider a couple of things in a different light. So I will share a couple of my doubts with you. So what I would do today is I will make an introduction and a context for those who are not specialists of the Gulag. I see many specialists of the Gulag, which is fantastic here, but I imagine many are not exactly familiar with the topic. Then I will explain the cultural scene of the Solovki prison camp, and then speak about the literary scene, because the two topics are probably, let's say, the key topics of my work, at least of this monograph. And then we'll get to a few conclusions. Throughout the talk, I will show a few of the images which you will find in the exhibition, and they are taken from the archives. They're materials that I've collected over these years of work, and hopefully will give you a little bit of light and a little bit of shine throughout a tale of a lot of pain. But let's hope that it will not be too terrible. So I will start with an introduction and a context. And the first introduction, the first thing I want to say is that this work originated from my desire to work on literature and the Gulag, to try to see the intersections, to start to see how literature, how people who have been in the Gulag create literature. And at the beginning, I had so many ideas and I didn't know what to do. And I started reading, and after reading a lot, I realized that usually what we mean with the term Gulag literature is this just big literary term, critical term, which usually doesn't have an exact definition, and usually something like the literature that deals with the Gulag. There is not a definition set in stone. It doesn't encompass a lot of things that, in my view, may be worth encompassing. And a lot of studies, of course, on single authors, mainly on Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov. I put the image of Shalamov because Sarah is the author of excellent works on Shalamov, also on Solzhenitsyn, but especially on Shalamov. And overall, I realized that there was a lack of assessment of this, which is, as much as I read, as I continued reading, I realized, as Sarah was saying just before, it's a huge page of Russian literature. It's nearing 100 years, and Sarah's good in saying that it's still going on. I mean, there's still works coming out, both new works and literary works that have been unpublished. And it's a page that has definitely been absolutely important. And I call it in my book the third front of Russian literature, with the two fronts being the Russian literature of the 20th century that developed in the USSR, or in Russia anyway, in Russian territory, and the one that developed in emigration, which is usually the bipolar, the bifold separation of Russian literature, as is usually intended, with a series of subcategories like internal immigration and so on. But this one is actually not being particularly studied. And so, as I kept on reading, I realized that there were a few empty pages, and one of them was what was written within the camps. What were the prisoners publishing in the camps? Because there were publications in the camps. But in all the books that I've read, I'm mentioning just two, which for me have been absolutely fundamental. Leone Tokar's Return from the Archipelago in 2000, and Luba, which is a French title. I would not read it because my French is absolutely horrible, but it's about the Gulag literature and the possibility of witnessing the horror in 2003. I didn't see any trace about literature produced within the camps. I did see a few things, for example, on Gulag poetry overall. There were a few essays on Shalamov's poetry, a few essays on other, but I would say quite marginal publications, even though excellent publications, of course, on poets like Anna Barkova, or the huge work done by Simon Vilinsky, who issued an anthology of poetry of the camps, but I felt like there was quite a gap. And then I realized that there were pages that needed to be rewritten. And the pages were, in particular, the one about the Solovki Gulag literature, in that it was usually shown as just either a strange phenomenon, but without any contextualization, or as a propaganda tool. And the more I read, the more I realized it was not the case. And then I felt that there was a huge gap in the studies about the publications of Soviet prisons and camps. One may ask, why exactly the Solovki? The reason is this, is that it started initially as a dissertation, as a PhD dissertation, and then developed over the years into something else. But my tutor was a specialist on 18th century Russian literature, so not exactly a Gulag specialist. And she knew that Likhachov had been in the camp. I didn't know that as well. And she said, why don't you read again what he wrote in the memoirs? And in the memoirs, I found this sentence. I've asked Claudia to send everybody a translation in English of the quotes. I will keep them there in Russian and discuss them so that whoever knows Russian will be able to read them, who doesn't will be able to read them on the handout, where one of the greatest scholars of Russian culture overall in the history of Russian culture, one of the greatest academic recognized worldwide, says that the camp for him was a second university. Likhachov was in the Solovki prison camp as a student, but first for importance. And then made me wonder, how is that possible that a guy speaks in these terms about the concentration camp, where you usually hear something else? And in particular, the Solovki are famous for its dark sides. It was a terrible camp, absolutely horrible situations, a history of pain, suffering, shootings, murders, tortures, rapes, everything you can put in it, you have it there. So I was very surprised by this. And it was from that the books came out. But first I want to give a little introduction about this camp. The SLON, it's that's the acronym of the camp, Sovietsky Lager Особого Назначения, which means the special purpose camp of the Solovki. How was a special purpose camp, and why was this? And incidentally, Slon means elephant in Russian, and this is an image that was used a lot in the publications of the camp. I will speak about this later on, the publications of the camp, not the elephant. But basically the story of the Solovki prison camp, which is universally considered the laboratory of the Gulag, which is a definition that may be questionable, but still, this is how it is considered, and it is quite acceptable overall. So the story is that after the revolution, a lot happens in terms of contextual situations. Of course, there is the reaction to the revolution, there is a civil war. The reaction by the Soviet is to of course, in a situation like this, arrest a lot of people. The arrests become so many, and people that are held are so many, and of course the arrests immediately take a different connotation. They don't arrest only people who actively fight against the system, but they actually take also people who could potentially be against the system. So noblemen, clergymen, and so on. All this that I'm speaking about is documented and well explained in lots of great publications. So they don't know where to put prisoners at a certain point. That really the jails can't fit them anymore. So they start thinking about the situations, and they at a certain point come to the conclusion of creating concentration camps. But the system is too expensive. The state spends a lot of money in keeping these prisoners up in these camps and these prisons. And at a certain point in 1923, the OGPU, which is the political police, which is the hair of the CK, and it will eventually become, changed name 1,000 times, it will eventually become the NKVD and so on. The OGPU is entitled to have one camp on the Solovki in 1923, and has a specific task, not only to create a new camp, and this is entitlement, it comes from the Sovnarkom, so the highest structure of power in the Soviet Union, not only to set up a camp, but to create a system. So you have to isolate categories of prisoners, hence the особого назначения, but also the system needs to make the forced labor profitable. This is an extract from the постановление, from the decision of the Sovnarkom, which spells out exactly what they have to do, which is quite clearly 6 points. The fifth is clearly the one of making the forced labor profitable, because all prisoners in the camps and in the prisons of the Soviet state at that time, well, it is already the Soviet Union. I'm always very careful about the dates. In the Soviet Union at that time, they were employed in forced labor, but it was not profitable, and the state was spending a huge amount of money into this enterprise. The first years, the goal, the objective of making it profitable does not work. And at a certain point on the scene comes Naftalii Frenkel, who you see in this photograph. Naftalii Frenkel comes in the Solovki as a prisoner and rises immediately within a matter of few years to a very prominent role. And he does this because he's the one who actually finds the solution to how to make the system profitable. There are different opinions on whether it was him who invented sort of thing, whether he borrowed, but what it's clear is that his ideas were the one that were eventually then implemented first in the Solovki, and then in this White Sea-Baltic Canal, and then overall in all the system of the camps. So the Solovki in that sense is a laboratory, is the place where they created the idea of how to exploit the prisoners. And the ideas are already contained in an article that Frenkel writes as a prisoner in 1925. He will then be liberated early in 27 and then become one of the most important figures in the history of the Gulag. And one of the key ideas is the one of using the forced labor outside of the camps to boost the economy, to create a new state, a new system of infrastructures and so on. And so for this reason, after this is accomplished and after the White Sea-Baltic Canal starts to being built, many of the activities of the SLON before and after this passage start to be moved to different camps, in particular the one of the BBK, which was the Bielbatlak, which was the camp organized to support the building of the White Sea-Baltic Canal. So the camp remains there, but it loses its prominence, becomes overpopulated in the 30s. Lots of people are sent to the Solovki, but there is a change in the demographics of the prisoners. Initially, there's a lot of noblemen, a lot of intellectuals, a lot of clergymen, and so on. With time, the mass of people that just reaches the Solovki archipelago becomes huge, and there is not this specific distinction of the demographics. And in 1937, the camp changes and becomes a prison. Within a system of camps, there are a series of changes in the institution and the system of camps related to the Solovki. And this is also a very sad year for the Solovki prison camp, because even though, of course, killings of prisoners and deaths of prisoners have occurred throughout the years, as I said, it's one of the worst camps. 1937 is a particularly tough year. It is a year where the Great Terror slashes the prisoners, thousands are killed. There is, for example, a famous echelon of 1,111 prisoners, which initially were 1,116 prisoners, sent to Karelia to be executed in Sovnarkom, the so-called Solovetsky etape. And then abruptly, all of a sudden, in 1939, the camp is shut down because it's too close to the Finnish border when the Winter War starts and becomes a naval base. And out of the sudden, the Solovki camp doesn't exist anymore. I just wanted to say that the painting that you see is a painting by one of the people killed in Sovnarkom, Ivan Diemsky, and we have found these paintings now because of the exhibition, but I don't want to speak about this, but it's the first time, it was in 2017, that they were shown to the public after they were made in the camp in 1937. I've chosen to show history from the sources that I had at my disposal, the historical camp, the resources, archival documents, and so on. But I've decided to use also the memoirs, because sometimes they integrated the information that I had on the camp. And archival documents sometimes, to be fair, are not entirely reliable, and I have devoted some space in my monograph to this particular problem of the sources, of how to manage the sources. Just want to point it out because there is a part about this, and then maybe someone wants to know it, wants to know something in the discussion. But I also wanted to show the prisoner's point of view. There is a tale that was told by one of the people, the many people that I spoke to during the years of this work, which she referred to the memoirs of the Solovki camp as the tale of the blind man and the elephant, where a few blind men touch the elephant in different places, and depending on who touches what, they think there is something else, a rope, a tree, and so on. And she said that the variety of experiences within the camp is so incredible that it resembles that. So I felt it was fair to show also what came out of the memoirs, what were the experience of the camps. And also, I understood immediately that the sources at my disposal, both archival and from previous publications, were not enough to understand the cultural scene of the camp, which was the key of my work, and to which I switch right now in the second part. So, as I said, the thing that's absolutely astonishing of the Solovki prison camp is the cultural scene. I mean, of course, many things are astonishing about this camp. There's plenty of publications devoted to it, but the cultural scene that developed in the Solovki prison camp is unprecedented. That's absolutely incredible. It was, if you compare it to what was happening in other camps, it's something that doesn't really make sense in a way. And I will show you why, what I mean when I say it doesn't really make sense. But the thing that was quite astonishing to me when I started my work, I started in 2008, was that the scene was not particularly studied. And apart from one monograph published in 1995 by Naftalii Kuviakina, who unfortunately soon afterwards died, and so she could not continue her work on the topic, that monograph was devoted to the theater of the Solovki prison camp. Apart from that, there was a huge emptiness. So it was just something that was mentioned every now and then in many publications. For example, Anne Applebaum refers to it in the background, but of course her book is not devoted entirely to the Gulag, to the Solovki prison camp, but to the Gulag overall. And the literary scene was particularly overlooked. No one really had studied it. There were a few poems published here and there in anthologies and articles, but there wasn't really a study on it. There were a few reflections by Likashov and other people, but really it was not there. And so I thought it was worth trying to understand the cultural scene to explain then the literary scene. And it came out that the dynamics of power that came out from the camp publications and from the archival documents that I have managed to see during the many years of work that I've had on this specific topic have made me understand, made me explain the unexplainable, made me come up with an answer. And that's what the book speaks about. So when we talk about cultural activities of the SLON, I want to point out the images that you see that come from the archives. They're all images of prisoners. The people that you see in there are all prisoners. The prisoners were involved in a huge amount of activities. There were theaters, let me use the plural. There was one main theater in the camp, one central theater, which is the one from which this photograph is taken. But there were actually different, the Solovki camp was scattered around the archipelago, and they had different adilienia, different sections. And they had actually a few sections on the mainland, specifically in Kiem, which was the harbor from which the prisoners were sent to the Solovki, and where eventually the administration was taken. And there were different theaters in the different adilienia. There were music, so there were theater plays, and actually lots of people involved. And when I say people, I don't just mean prisoners, amateurs. There were in the Solovki prison camp directors, there were famous actors, there were playwrights, and so on. Same applies to music. There were excellent musicians. There was a library which was made primarily of books that were confiscated to people who were arrested and eventually sent to the Solovki camp. And the library of the Solovki camp was so incredible that one of the greatest Soviet geologists, Ivan Cherkov, had his education in the camp, in that library. And there were publications allowed. there was a club where people would have discussions on Oriental philosophy, or as Likhachov says, on the Logos and so on. There was a Krim Kab, which was mentioned actually in the quote that I spoke about before by Likhachov, the Kriminologicheski Kabinet, the study of criminology, which was one of the many research activities set up on the camps. And in later years, when Pavel Floriensky, the so-called Russian Leonardo, specialist of Russian, know exactly who I'm talking about. Those who don't know, I'm talking of one of the greatest intellectual figures in Russian history, who ended up in the Solovki prison camp and unfortunately was executed in 1937 in Levashov, not in Salamokh, but still in the same wave of executions. He worked there in one of the research activities, which was the biological station. And what is absolutely incredible is that activities like these happen in other camps, not entirely, not all of them. But what is incredible is that in the Solovki prison camp, the people who led these activities were the intelligenti, so the representative of the Russian intelligentsia, who were in theory supposed to be eliminated, who were in theory supposed to be changed and put in jail to be silenced, and instead were the leaders who were bringing forward this, cultural scene. So when you see what happened in the rest of the Soviet Union or the Soviet state before 1922, there were cultural activities in all the prisons and camps, and they were led by this idea, the перевоспитание, the idea that prisoners had to be re-educated. Because in theory, there is of course a huge discrepancy between the theory and the reality, what eventually happened. But in theory, the Soviet system, penitentiary system, was aimed at re-educating the prisoners. So you would end up in a camp and through forced labor, you will be re-educated to become a new citizen. So you would say, enter the camp as a nobleman and then work your way through and go out of the camp as a re-educated Soviet citizen ready to contribute to the common cause. Now, this is in theory, obviously I'm simplifying something that's quite complex, but this concept was fundamental for the development of the culture of the Gulag in these first years. And there was an overall control over this camp culture, the culture in the camps, and this was given to the GUMZ. Главное управление местами заключения was one of the institutions created at the beginning of, in the first years of the Soviet state, to oversee the penitentiary system. There were different ones that were actually competing between themselves. I'll speak about this a little bit in my monograph. But GUMZ was the one that was entitled to the camps and the prisons until then, in 1930, the creation of the Gulag, the institution that gives name to the camps now today, thanks to Solzhenitsyn archipelago Gulag, was created. But the GUMZ had this control over the prisons and camps and was really keen to sponsor re-education, to sponsor cultural activities. They had some control over camp publications until in the 20s, the Glavlit, which was the institution created to oversee Soviet censorship, took over. But when I speak about publication, when I speak about cultural enterprises, I'm speaking of a huge phenomenon. In Alla Gorcheva's book, Presa Gulaga, there is a list of how many publications there were between 1918 and 1955, and she listed 487. So we're talking of widespread phenomenon. And a major change happened, which somehow seals the end of my book. My book has a time limit from 1923 to 1930, which is the moment where the publications in the Solovki are closed in their form. And it coincides with the moment where with the rise of Stalinism, the idea of перевоспитание, of re-education, is left to the side, and the idea of перековка, from the verb перековать, reforge, physically reforge prisoners, takes prominence, and it will lead eventually all the cultural activities of the camps. But in my book, I do not talk about this, so I'm just mentioning it. Also because the term перековка actually came from, most probably from a newspaper published on the Solovki in 1930. This is a quote from that shows how much the GUMZ was interested in the re-education. So this is one of the many directives. There is a fund in the State Archive in Moscow, the GARF 4042, which is entirely devoted to all the documents produced and the activities of the GUMZ. And there's so many interesting things in that fund. And this is one of the many directives. You will see guidelines for how to make cultural activities. You will see lots of statistics and so on. But this gives you an idea of what we're talking about, right? So yes, cultural activities, but only of a certain type. So no violence, no adventures. Prisoners do not need to be entertained. Culture there is not an entertaining tool. Culture has to be one of the means which correct the criminals. And here criminals, we don't mean only criminals in terms of people who commit, for example, a murder, but also political criminals. Prestupnik in the Soviet system is also the bourgeois, the nobleman, the clergy who is not fit to the state. So this is the general aims. And this other one is specifically taken again from the same fund, is specifically about the publication. It speaks why there were so many publications, because the idea was that the prisoners had to be empowered. They had to do their own activities, cultural activities. So through theater, through publications and so on, they had to re-educate themselves, because their own work, here they speak in the publication, their own word is far more credible than the one that we give them. This is the idea. So this is what really informs the system. This is what really informs the proliferation of publications and cultural activities around the Soviet Union. But the Solovki is really particular. Well, first, you can see from this image, the quality of the publication is incredible. In that same state archive, but in also in other archives, for example, the archive of memorials are full of publications of the camps. You will see the quality of these publications, which quite often are very poor, which is the reason why many of them died quite quickly. Some of them are even handwritten. It's absolutely fascinating. Some of them are put together with glue or with staples. It's something absolutely fantastic. And the first publications of the camp, the Solovki prison camp, were exactly like this. The Astrovok is the first one which is published, which was the journal by the guards in 1923. The camp is set up in November 1923, so it's the very beginning. It's a very, as soon as they set foot in the Solovki, they immediately start producing publications. But then, in 1924, they start the first official journal, which is called, like the camp, SLON. And later, they realized that this journal doesn't really work, and they recall it Solovetsky Ostrova, which in the book and in the quotes that you'll find here has the acronym SO. And the Solovetsky Ostrova will be the main camp publication, and it will be the one that will lead the culture, that will show the unique culture that develops at the Solovki prison camp, and will be counterbalanced by a gazeta, so a newspaper created, a weekly newspaper created in 1925 called Novye Solovki, the New Solovki, to show somehow a more ideologically fit production. But apart from those ones, there were dozens of stien gazety, so of wall newspapers, so newspapers made of one sheet of paper and attached to the walls and corridors and different places, and other publications. It is an incredibly varied scene, but I decided to focus on these ones, which for me were the most important ones. And at the beginning, the SLON complies with the regulations of the GUMZ. So the output is actually ideologically fit, is actually the one that somehow follows the idea of перевоспитание, is full of poems that speak about, oh, how happy I am here, the state is recreating me, or things like this. I'm of course simplifying, but this is the type of output that you will find. But then after they published Solovetsky Ostrova, things start to change. And it's incredible because within the matter of a few months, the freedom of expression, the freedom of literary form becomes more and more prominent, to the point that, as I said, they have to create a new Gazeta to counteract that, this freedom of expression. And why was this cultural scene so incredible? It's because of this man, Fyodor Eichmanns, who before my research began was known as a Chekist, like a very prominent member of the Cheka from the first years, then a very prominent member of the OGPU, so prominent that when they created the Gulag, he was the first leader, the first head of the Gulag, and then executed like many other murderers of the NKVD during the Great Terror. But the more I studied, the more I realized that there was something more to him. And it came out from memoirs, but also from documents and from different resources, sources that are accessed, including the publications of the camp. There was actually the man that allowed this freedom. He was the one who created most of these cultural institutions. He was the one who who took the books confiscated during the arrest and brought them to the Solovki. He was the one who created and somehow defended on various occasions the Lagerna intelligentsia, so the intelligentsia of the camp, these members of pre-revolutionary Russian culture who were all closed in the camps. And he was really somehow the person who guaranteed that. This came from a series of discoveries that I made. I will share some of them with you now. But the reasons why he did this is unclear. He's clearly not a typical member of the political police. He was very well educated. He loved culture to the point that when he went to Vygach, an extremely remote area of the Soviet Union where temperatures are absolutely terrible, it's a constantly frozen place, more or less, he tried to set up a theater even there. So this could account for this. Irina Flieg is convinced that he was in love in that period, which is true. He fell in love with one of the prisoners. And also that there was a reason for this, because by showing this freedom of expression, then he could show outside the camps that prisoners were kept well. And this was very important in a period where the Soviet Union was under strict scrutiny because of the fact that words about the horrors happening in the camps had gone, of course, outside the borders of the Soviet Union. And there were many campaigns, mainly made by people who had escaped the camps, and most of them escaped, by the way, exactly the Solovki prison camp, to boycott the produce of the Soviet Union, and in particular the timber, which was the most important activity of the Solovki prison camp. So the newspapers, the journals were published not only outside of the Solovki prison camp, but also abroad. So it may well be that Eichmanns did this for this reason. Quite interesting that the image of Eichmanns has changed thanks to a novel, which I'm sure was not inspired by my book, because it came before the book was published. So quite interesting. I will speak about this later on. But this is one of the examples of how Fyodor Eichmanns sheltered these intellectuals and allowed them to have this cultural life within the camp and this much freedom. So this is an article, you have the handout there, where Eichmanns refers to the Kairovshina. This is one of the many terms of the slang of the camp. Kairovshina comes from the word Kaire, counter-revolutionaries, how they were he explains why they were so prominent. And he does this, framing the situation within a Marxist dialectics, within a Marxist reasoning, by which there is a social situation in the camp where the camps and commanders are the upper layer of the society, then there is the intelligentsia, and then there is the criminals, the common criminals, which are the proletariat, which will eventually come up the ranks. But up until that moment, we have to keep the intelligentsia in its prominent role, because they are needed there until we go. So he speaks, and sorry, I think I'm going too fast for the people who are trying to read this in Russian, who are needed as a technologically qualified class, which is necessary to implement the changes in the society of the camp. So this is the general framing of the defense that it takes of the intelligentsia, which, as you say, will be blocked and not allowed to be free. But this is the way that we need them, because otherwise we cannot aspire to a change in the society. Now, it seems to me that this was just a way of covering what really was happening. No matter what is the situation, of course, in my book, I give a lot of interpretations, but I cannot give a full answer as to why he did that. Still, what is out of doubt is that he was the person in charge of this incredible cultural scene. And you can understand it even more, because there is a moment in 1926 where GUMZ asks the SLON, so the central institution from Moscow, asks the SLON, the Solovki camp, why their press is so particular. And Eichmann, it's him who sends a reply on the 25th of March 1926 to Moscow to explain why they're allowing that much freedom. But soon after that, the publication are closed, and this is happens exactly when Eichmann goes to Moscow, is moved from the Solovki to Moscow. And in 1929, Gorky visits the camp. This is one of the images of his visit, the famous novelist Maxim Gorky. Gorky visits the camp, and publication restart. Now, it's unclear as to why they restarted in this brief period from 1929 to 1930, but this is the time where Eichmann rises again to prominence. So it may well be there was him behind the scene, or it may well be there was Gorky's visit, because Gorky then published an essay, and he spoke about publications that were active in the camp. So it could be that the publications were restarted to justify that. Anyway, this is the reasons behind the cultural scene. Now let's have a look at the literary scene, because the literary scene follows this dynamics of a camp which initially set up as being the laboratory of the Gulag, as extremely harsh, initially follows the directives of only ideologically fit literature, and then slowly more freedom of expression comes out, and then eventually there is a complete difference between some intelligentsia members, some intelligenti, some authors who are allowed to publish, and others, and the Gazeta Novy Solovki, the newspaper, where you see only ideologically committed texts. So initially, as I said, there's only these ideologically fit texts that are published. And what comes out is quite fascinating, is what I call locus fidelitatis. So like the poets in classic times used to make the locus modestiae to justify their work into the eyes of the muses, these writers, who, let's not forget, had no idea about what the consequences were of their words, they would do locus fidelitatis. So they would show allegiance to the power in a part of whatever they were publishing, and by showing this, they would allow themselves to speak in harsher terms about the realities of the camp. The first turning point comes with a person called Boris Golubakovsky, who arrives in the camp and changes completely and becomes somehow the mano longa of Eichmann, and is the person that really leads the change in the cultural scene and in the literary scene. And then eventually this becomes something absolutely outstanding in terms of freedom of expression. At the very early stage of my work, I came to see Arlen Viktorovich Blum, who was one of the greatest scholars in terms of censorship in the Soviet Union. And when he read, he had no idea about what was published in the Solovki prison camp. When I showed him the text, he was so excited. He was literally laughing and jumping on the bed and saying, these people were freer than the people that were in freedom. So let me show you an example of locus fidelitatis. So I will show you a few glimpses of what the book is about, but of course I can't go in depth into everything. I will just show you what I speak about. This is one of the texts written by Nikolai Litvin, one of the most important writers of the first phase of publications. And this is a locus fidelitatis. You have it in your outline, in your handout, where this tale, Paviham, is about his experience as a defeated member of the White Army, the defeated army of the Civil War. And there is the description of the sheer desperation and of the need to change the phenomenon of the smienovekovstvo, the changes of the Vieche, the changes of the references, is something that happened in emigration to people that had fled the Soviet state. And then while they were abroad and they understood the Soviet had won the Civil War, they proposed to accept the Soviets. And the Soviet Union proposed them to return, to be completely pardoned. But most of these people, as soon as they set foot in the Soviet Union, they were arrested and sent to the camps. And this is the story that happened to Litvin. So Litvin explains this and is allowed to show true, honest feelings of desperation in his tale. But then he puts this piece where he says that the Solovki for us is the beginning of a new life and so on. And this allows him to express his feelings. So this is a typical example of a logos fidelitatis. As I said, Glubokowski is the person that really changes the scene of the Solovki prison camp. This is taken from one of his essays, but he wrote a lot of prose and a lot of poetry also under pseudonym, where he speaks about the situation. He says that there is a fight between the past and the future in the Solovki, but it's not reflected in the camp publications. And so he calls for a sincerity of the writers. And from that moment onwards, the sincerity really kicks in. Also thanks to, again, the fact that Eichmanns allowed these people to be extremely sincere. And when I say insincere, I mean that lots of things come out. Some of them in terms of Aesopian language. So there's a few female writers who, in their writing, hint at the terrible situations of the women who were forced to marry camp prisoners, who were forced to rape, and so on. And this is an excerpt from one of the few tales written by Sofia Ockerman, a prisoner, who speaks about a woman that falls in love with a camp commander, and eventually the camp commander is arrested, and so she loses the protection. And actually through this, you have this sort of moment where you see the universe of pain that is hidden behind that. But this freedom of expression becomes absolutely huge in the few years to come. In 1926, for example, on the Sovietsky Ostrova, I published a few poems which are very openly critical to the Soviet power. In the first one, you see that there is Mephistopheles with the mouth of a Red Army soldier, which is a clear hint to the fact that the Red Army soldiers, so the Chekists, were killing people. And you have the poems written upon the death of Sienin, which was extremely popular because some of the prisoners, including Glubokowski, whom you see here in this photograph, were actually friends and comrades, colleagues of Sienin. And one of them publishes that didn't spare Seryozha, which is a clear accusation to the Soviet state in the camp. As I said, this sort of freedom of expression is the one that triggered the creation of Novye Solovki, the other Gazeta, which was more ideologically committed. And the thing that is interesting is that then in 26, the publication ceased completely, both the Novye Solovki and the Solovetsky Ostrova. And when they were started in 1929, as I was saying before, they're two polar opposites. On the one hand, you have a typical Lagerная Gazeta. Novye Solovki becomes a prototype of what will eventually be the publications of the camps as they are recounted, usually, for example, the ones of the Belomorsko, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, which are very strong propaganda tool. And the Solovetsky Ostrova becomes a literary almanac, basically, where you see a huge amount of phenomena which you would not see in many publications of the camps. It is really a monument to camp literature. You would find lyricism, humor, avant-garde, and so on. It is incredible reading. So I will show you just a few writers, and then I'll come to the conclusions because I'm aware the time is running. This is, in my modest opinion, the greatest poet of the Solovki prison camp, Vladimir Kemetsky, who came, like many others from abroad after immigration, came back to the Soviet Union. As soon as he set foot in the USSR, he was arrested and taken to the camp. And he had an experience in immigration. He started as a poet. It was actually quite, I wouldn't say prominent, but rising to fame in the circles, first of Paris and then in Berlin. And then after the arrest, changed completely his attitude towards poetry and started engaging a dialogue with his muse, the muse that follows him in the camps and shares the destiny of his life. So there are plenty of poems by Kiemecki that are absolutely brilliant. Some of them are absolutely fantastic, I think, and they show a very high degree of work on the verse. This is what, in my eyes, is the favorite, because it also hints at a series of images that come from the Solovki prison camp, and are ideally written in a letter, in a song to a lover. But they actually hide behind scenes of life in the islands. They actually hide a lot of information about the real living conditions of the prisoners. So, for example, you have here «Расскажу тебе про народ неприветливых этих мест, отвяженный, просто живет, пьет тюлени и рубит лес», speaking about the people of these places that kills, clubs, seals, and fells timber. Well, this was the activity of the camp, fells timber. It's talking in theory of this, the people, but it's talking actually about the prisoners. And it's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful poem. I know a scholar should not speak about beauty, but I have to say, I've always been very touched. And I have to say that all the people that have encountered the poems by Kiemecki have all been very touched by him. Another incredible poet of the second phase, I speak about two phases of Solovki publication, is Yuri Kazarnovsky. A very sad fate. Kazarnovsky was a very talented and gifted humorist, and he published in the Solovki publications dozens of parodies, and the parodies were called what would a famous writer do if it was in the Solovki? So there are parodies of Pushkin, there are parodies of Blok, there are parodies of Mayakovsky, of great poets. So it seems like from different memoirs comes out that Kazarnovsky had an incredible memory, and he knew a huge amount of poems, and so he recreated these poems and made parodies out of them. And so you have an example here of how a poem by Sienin is changed completely and is made into a parody. This is a very famous poem, Pismo Materi, which he completely changes in his version on the Solovki, filling it with puns. And what is interesting to see is that some of these puns are not exactly easy to understand at the first look, and probably some of them are completely lost. So, for example, when you have there the last line, which speaks about, we want to go back to -6, one thing that is hinting about to the temperature. What is hinting at is the fact that when people were released from the camps, they were not allowed to go in the main cities of the Soviet Union. So, for example, the usual would be the -10, the -10. So they would not allow to go to the 10 biggest cities in the Soviet Union. So this is actually a hint, something that you get only if you have a knowledge of the context. And the most incredible, I think, of all the writers is of the second phase is Alexander Yaroslavsky. Yaroslavsky was a rather known poet, the leader of the Biocosmist, which was one of the many different currents of Russian avant-garde. This is one example of the type of things that they would write. But he would write, Yaroslavsky in Freedom, also things that could be, for example, resembled to De Bouchil, and contain a lot of experiments in terms of formal poetry. In the camp, he published only 2 sonnets. Sonnets are very plain in its stylistic form. There's no particular experimental idea. There is a hint of his previous career, but it's completely changed. And this one in particular is the last one that he published, and is particularly striking for how it changes and the amount of hidden information there is in there that actually refers to the tragic story that will lead to his death and to the one of his wife, who was trying to rescue him for the camp. So coming to conclusion, I know that this is getting a little bit late, so I will be very, 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 very quick. There are many things that can be said about this. This was a literary enclave where there was a particular receptive system. The people were writing poetry, but they were writing to their fellow prisoners. And most of these intellectuals were writing to their intellectual friends. So they could jump free censorship, because the censors would just not get those hands. And at the same time, they would give them hidden and more nuanced meaning in their works. So it's something absolutely fascinating. And the creative process was shaped by this receptive community, which changed completely the semantic and the semiotic somehow sphere of this literature. And of course, these prisoners, apart from very few of them, did not have the chance to write these things, so they had to conceive them in their head. And how this had an impact on the literary form, and how this was unique to the camp was absolutely outstanding. And it was also influenced by the literary pedigree of these writers. The fact that these writers, most of them, were born during the Silver Age. So the most typical literary forms, for example, the sonnet, the crown of sonnets, and so on, of the Silver Age were used in the camp. So there is a direct link with this. So it is somehow a stream of 20th century Russian literature. And there is also the very fascinating fact of how they were using pseudonyms and how this had an importance in terms of autobiographical studies, in terms of identity of the writers. What did they want to say? What did they want to do by using a certain pseudonym instead of another one? In some cases was underlining a change of direction. In other cases was instead the opposite, retaining an identity as an author, even in those situations. So then concluding, I want to say, go back to the original question. What is then Gulag literature? Should we reconsider the corpus? Should we encompass what was written inside the camp? Should we speak of an internal Gulag literature? Hence the title. Should we think that we need to have a new understanding of Gulag literature that's not just Shalamov, Solzhenitsyn, Yevgeny Ginsburg, and so on, but we should actually keep a wider look? And could we identify structures, fetches along the corpus that can help us create a framework? And could this be of help to understand what has been written now about the Gulag in post-memorial texts, for example, like Prilepin's Abitial, The Abode, which is the book that was referring to above, that speaks about Ekmans in a completely different light, or in Vadalaskin, Aviator, or even if we consider not just the Solovki camp, but also the Gulag overall, the works by Kuviakina. So I've been trying to do this all these years, and I was hoping that this book and the many articles I published on the topic would help changing the position. But looking upon this and looking upon what is happening outside, so conferences I've been invited to, books that have come out, for example, the wonderful book by Leona Toker, which came out last year, seems like the ideas remain the same. There's not really that much consideration of internal Gulag literature. There's really not that much consideration of these authors and the idea of Gulag literature. So I wonder if it is actually a scholarly defeat, if my hope is not going to happen, if we've lost this chance forever. So on this, I will stop myself. I will really thank you for being here, and I'll be very happy to hear your comments, critiques, or anything else. Thank you. I'll stop sharing, actually.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for a wonderful talk. And ending on rather a downbeat note there, when I really don't think you should be thinking about this as a defeat. Still, certainly lots of work to do, though, in terms of changing how people accept this literature as part of the Gulag literature. Do we have any questions? Do please We've got a couple of comments there, from Jane Harrison. Absolutely brilliant, fascinating, many thanks. And another one, many thanks for an engaging presentation. Somebody who has to run. Do we have any questions? I have a question to start with, actually, which is just a small thing, really. When you talked about the fact that the publications really began as soon as the camp opened in 1923, and so this was obviously already part of the plan when the camp first opened. Was that already Eichmann's influence? And were prisons that were opened before that, did they have any publications? Or was this a completely new thing at this point?
So the first ever publication, the one I referred to, was actually the publication of the guards themselves. So it was actually them. I don't have evidence that this was already Eichmann's, just because there's no copies left of this publication, and what we know about it actually comes from an article written on the Solovki, Solovetsky Ostrova, in one of the publications that were related to Solovetsky Ostrova, because there were also other publications I didn't speak about, which were more scholarly. Some of them actually are still referred to in studies of biology or archaeology of the archipelago, but I will not speak about this. In one of these ones, there is an article which is called Solovetsky Pichet, which speaks about the history of the publications, and so there is a hint in that, but I would not be able to say if it was Eichmann's. So I had a moment where I couldn't hear well, but I think you were asking if the prisoners had publications before coming to the camps, if I understood correctly, or if they became poets in the camp. Is that what you were asking?
Were there publications in other prisons before Solovki?
So you're asking if these prisoners were publishing before being arrested, before coming to the Solovki? Is that what you're saying? Sorry.
No. If other prisons had their own publications.
Oh yes, sorry. I've understood now. Prison. I could constantly hear prisoners. Sorry, that's why. Sorry. Yes, there's plenty. There were plenty. Some of them actually start in the very first months soon after the revolution. I think the first one is from 1918. There were actually many publications around in other prisons, and actually quite interesting in that there were some exchanges between prisons and some influences somehow within the different publications. So it would happen sometimes that someone would be shifted, some director would be shifted from one camp to another, and bring, in a way, the publication, bring to the new camp what they were doing. There is a very very important, I would say, famous to me. Probably I'm the only one, together with a few people, who knows about this, whose name was Yuri Bekhtierev. He was a prominent member of the GUMZ, but initially was a leader of one of the camps. And when he arrived to GUMZ, when he was actually transferred to Moscow to oversee the system, he actually informed a lot of the camps that were eventually made. So in a way, there was this sort of system underneath, if that's more or less what you were asking, if I understood correctly. Yes, good.
Thank you very much. So question in the chat, what would you say are the aesthetics of Solovki literature? Do Silver Age aesthetics predominate? And if so, is the literature of Solovki a kind of time capsule?
Thank you very much. I can see the question in the chat. That's a very interesting and a very good way of putting it. Time capsule, I actually speak of enclave, but time capsule is actually a very good way. So the aesthetics are definitely influenced by Silver Age literature. You see a lot of it. For example, in the conclusion, I speak a lot about one poem by Kemetsky again, where it refers to the Prekrasnaya Dama, which is one of the key concepts of Silver Age literature, in particular about symbolism. And what is interesting, though, is that when it comes into use in a poem published in the camp, written in the camp, the meaning can really explode. That's the word that I use. So, for example, this poem in particular was referred to one of the women who were forcibly married to one of the camp commanders. She was very fond of Kemetsky's works. So Kemetsky wrote this poem, devoted it to her, calling her Prekrasnaya Dama, and calling for her help to survive. But of course, if you put these things in context, and the fact that he uses also the image of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and fertility, you can see that the meaning can change a lot, you know, like, so the Prekrasnaya Dama can bring you to another dimension, but the other dimension can be somehow just survival, you know, and it's an aesthetization of the attempt to survive. So there's plenty of such things. I would say that there is definitely a very strong imprint from the Silver Age. There is far less than in other camps outputs an imprint of futurism and of avant-garde, usually used in more ideologically committed works, but there is, whereas if you see things written in other camps, you see more of that. And there are also other, I don't know how to say, other unique outputs, which really represents something quite unique, and it would be quite long to discuss. I see that there's still other questions coming, so I hope that my reply was good enough, but if you want to know more, of course, I can go back to it. And I had my baby knocking on the door, so it may not be that he crushes the party.
These things are always acceptable, I think, these days. I think. Another question in the chat: was access to the Russian archives difficult?
Right. So it's a very difficult question to reply to, because the access is there. You can work in the archives. I worked in many archives. But what is there and what is available is something a bit more complicated to discuss. So I have worked in the State Archive, the Central Archive. I've worked in other archives, but there were a few things that have somehow disappeared. So, for example, the first time I went to Garf, there was a Journalny fond where all these newspapers and journals from the camps that had been sent to Moscow from the camps were kept. So I could actually touch the first things, the first publications. And when I came back a few years down the line, they were no longer there. No one could tell me where they were, and I've made a few inquiries. It's still not clear where they are. I want to hope that they had not been destroyed; they've just been moved. But the fact is, I haven't been able to go back to them. There are personal files. For example, it has been very difficult to rebuild the biographies of these people, and there were personal files. There is a law on Russian archives by which you cannot access a document until the 75th year of its creation. So I was told to wait for some of them. For example, the one about Kemetsky's life, his lichное дело, his personal file. And when I went there after the 75th year, they had the document had disappeared from the list. So where it has ended up, I really had no idea. And again, I made inquiries and no one could say it. But in terms of making a work like this and working with Gulag literature, and everybody that works in the Gulag knows this, it's fundamental to go to the NGOs that work on the topics, particularly Memorial, which has been fundamental for my work, the different branches, Moscow, St. Petersburg, in particular St. Petersburg, I have to say. But you also have to be creative. So through the different archives, through the different people that I met, I managed to get to private archives, and that's where I found additional material. I had to go also abroad in other places. So in a way, yes, you can work in the archives. There's no particular risk. The access is open, but it's not necessarily easy to find everything that you need to find. You may need to go to other places. And I have to say that, but this relates to another part of work that I've done. I am convinced that there is somehow an archival issue in Russia with specific to things that relate to Soviet repression in the Gulag, but it would take me 2 hours to speak about this, and I think that there's other questions. So I'll stop myself there.
Okay, so Quite a long question here. Many thanks for this fascinating lecture. Solovki Islands and the camps have long been a fascination of mine. I research a particular island in the former Yugoslavia, which is also a re-education through socially beneficial labour camp with a surprisingly lively cultural life. Hence, your talk was one of the more engaging, all the more engaging to me. As an environmental historian, I have to ask, could you say more on the works which speak about the islands itself, or on any or that in any meaningful way describe, reflect, or comment on the landscape?
Thank you very much. And I imagine you're talking about Gullotta, which I've studied but never wrote about because I'm not a specialist of that. I would be very interested to know more about your research. Milica, I read the name now. Yes, there is a lot of references to the island and to the landscape. So it takes, of course, I would say, it takes different ways, the references to the island. So, for example, a few of these writers use the Solovki in particular. Solovki archipelago is a particularly interesting case because you must have understood it from the images. It was a place where there used to be a monastery, one of the most important monastery, I would say, in Russian Orthodox Church. And there are a lot of people who used the history of the place to somehow speak about their own experience. But when it comes to the island, if you're talking in particular about the physical places, there are actually a few very, very fascinating poems. I'll be very happy to share them with you if you'd like to, that speak about the shore, the sand, the traces in the sand. There is a lot of references to timber, to the food, to the forest, to getting lost in the forest. There is, of course, a lot of references to the water. And the thing that I find most astonishing, I don't know if in Gullotta is the situation is the same, if it is Gullotta that you're talking about, of course, but there is a constant image, and it's the one of the seagull. The seagull that with its annoying yell reminded constantly to prisoners that there is freedom up there and they are in there. And the seagull comes and returns and comes back constantly in the cultural output, sometimes in ironic terms, sometimes in actually quite painful terms. So there are a few references. I'll be very happy to share them with you if you'd like to.
Can I just add to that? Traces are a massive, massive theme in Gulag literature generally.
Sure.
And in fact, also, as I've realized recently, in pre-revolutionary prison writing as well. So this is something that I'm sort of thinking about increasingly.
Thank you, Sarah. You're welcome.
Let's see, we've got lots of questions in the chat still. How did the publications survive and get into wider circulation? Did prisoners take copies out with them?
No. So the publication survived because of the Soviet system. So a few of them survived because they were stored in the Moscow archives, because, as I said, at a certain point, GUMZ asked to have copies of the publication to oversee what was being done. So plenty of them arrived to Moscow and are kept in the archives. Well, as I said, they were visible before. Now I'm not entirely sure they still are, but because, as I said, they were used for to show outside that the prisons were not that bad, the camps were not that bad, they were sold in Moscow, in Leningrad, and they were sold abroad. So a few of them have been handed down by relatives of prisoners who this way were trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening in the place where the relatives were kept. And then with time, they kept them and then they donated it, for example, to Memorial or to Sakharov Center or so on. And a few are abroad. So there are collections, for example, in Helsinki, there are a few of them in Berlin. So you would find a few of them. And the greatest luck that we have as researchers is that, I don't know who had this brilliant idea, but all the collection of the GARF, the Central State Archive, has been digitized by the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam for Brill. And it's impossible to buy now, because we tried to buy it in Glasgow and they couldn't make it into a different form than microform, but it is present in a few libraries around the world, I think 10 to 12. So they can still be accessed, all of them.
Actually, the next question leads on very well from that. Is there any information about the materiality of these publications? What were they made from? Where in the camps were they made? Were the tools and materials provided to the prisoners? Or is there, what sort of information is there about the making process?
So that, thankfully, we do have a few information about the Solovki. We actually have a lot of information because the Solovki was such a prominent place. They were actually sent very good equipment, and a fraudster who used to work with fake money, for false money, a falsery, was entitled to run the typography, a guy called Slipjan, and became actually quite a character in the publication. So you see every now and then the sketch of Slipjan at work and so on. And there was an important moment where, from the first rudimentary equipment, which many camps had, as I said, they would use like paper, sometimes it will be handwritten, sometimes it will be typewritten literally on the typewriting machine and then put together either with glue or with staples or with a piece of cord and so on. But at a certain point in Solovki, they gave them the so-called Amerikanka, which was a typewriting machine coming from America. I don't know why they got it from America, which was extremely good. And this is the reason why the images of they are shown you, and in general, the quality of the publications of the camp were so high. But for what concerns the other camps, all camps had some typographical equipment, depending on how strong was the commitment of the head of the camp to re-education, then you would see different equipment being given. But overall, I would say that all of them, I mean, the handwritten one are not that many. I would say that most of them had anyway, either typewriting machines that they could use or some sort of typographic equipment that they would use as well. So it really would depend from camp to camp.
Okay, and I think we may be on the last question for the moment, certainly. Would you say there is a metaphor problem for scholars of Gulag literature, that the idea of the camp system, which may be easier to describe as history, does not match with the cultural capsules of cultural production?
Wow, that's a very good point. I think I would like to hear what you think as well, Sarah. That is a very interesting point, and thank you very much for that. I never thought of that in these terms. You may be right. You may be right. There is a problem. Well, you know what came to my brain as soon as Sarah read this question. One of the first discussions I've had about the Gulag was with Irina Friga in 2007. I was still a student then, and that's the reason why I decided to choose this topic. And one of the things that she was saying is that we have a problem. We, as in she's one of the leading figures of Memorial, and also a very, very good scholar. She said, we have a problem, and the problem is that we use the language used by the repression. So we use the terms used by the repression. So when we speak about rehabilitation, we're doing a mistake, because you are rehabilitated if you committed a crime. But if you, as a victim, say that you have been rehabilitated, you're somehow giving, justifying the idea that you are a criminal. And this sort of thinking has also been something that has always made me question about the terms that I use. When it comes to literary use to metaphor problem, you may be right, but the problem is, in one of the talks that I made recently, I was speaking about the problem of Solzhenitsyn, of how he's been has played this fantastic role in actually letting the world know about the Gulag, and somehow being the leading channel to convey literature, Gulag history, Gulag culture to the world. but also somehow shaping the way we speak about this. So if we speak about the Gulag, if we speak about the Gulag archipelago, it comes from him. So if we're talking about the metaphor, then the camp system may be definitely a problem, but for some things it may actually work well, because if you think of it, so going back to the camp publications, these were actually part of a system. So the reason why so many prisons gave prisoners the possibility to write and to publish poetry, it can help describing a few things. But then, as you say, if we use the metaphor of the system, this would not apply, for example, to orally composed poetry, which was made by hundreds, if not thousands, of prisoners around the Soviet Union, and were not related to the system at all. They were subjected to the system, and you can see some features, and at least in the works, the hundreds of works that I've read, that may be affected by the type of repression that we're subjected to. But then the system in itself did not really help. What do you think, Sarah?
I mean, I immediately started thinking in exactly the same terms as you did, actually, because the problem of language and the terms that we use is something that I found myself very, very hung up on. And again, the sort of the opposition of Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, and the fact that Shalamov very consciously does not use the terms that Solzhenitsyn uses. Solzhenitsyn is very much into the sort of appropriation of the system's own terms. Shalamov really doesn't want to do that, and it's quite clear Shalamov never uses Zek. I think it appears once in his entire oeuvre. And yet, but we are sort of left with this, because of Solzhenitsyn's legacy, we are left in this position where we almost have to fight against this. I'm thinking of Wilson Bell's fantastic article, "Is the Gulag an Archipelago?" And again, this is one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of traces, that how we get away from the archipelago as possibly an inappropriate way of thinking about it. But we are sort of constantly stymied by the terms that are we've been given. It is very, very difficult to get over them. Katie Duda, would you like to come in on this and tell us your thoughts? Katie? Hello? Or Andrea, would you like to sort of...
Sorry, I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm looking at you on two different screens. I apologize. No, it just has one of the, as somebody who works on the more sort of famous names of Gulag literature, it's hard to see connective tissue between the cultural production of Solovki and, say, the memoir production in the thaw era. And that has to be also a kind of educational system break, right? I can't imagine that Ginsburg read these poets, even though maybe some of her experiences are analogous. And so that makes it hard to say that they're of a piece, that they're of the same kind of literature. And that just seems to be a struggle when talking about camp literature overall.
I mean, I actually wonder, so given what was the publications from Solovki, and given that they were sort of being quite widely disseminated and available for sale, why we would assume that somebody like Yevgenia Ginsburg, for example, wouldn't have read those. I'm not sure. I mean, I can see the problem that they are very, very different. The work that's coming out of Solovki and the work that's of the memoirists of the 1960s and 70s are, yes, they are very, very different things. And again, I instinctively reach for Shalamov as a link between the two. But is it so unlikely that the memoirists would have, who were sort of around in the 1920s and 30s, would have read this stuff? I'm not sure.
May I add something, Sarah? Is that we should not underestimate the mobility of the Gulag system, since we're talking about the Gulag system. The fact that many prisoners were actually moved from camp to camp, were rearrested, were released. So, for example, the Solovki had a fame that they carried pretty much until the end of the Gulag system in the 80s, because there were poems, songs, and things. So for example, there's a song that eventually I found came out from a show, a theater play at the Solovki, which was eventually published in one of the journals, which is Море Белого Шир, I think it was called, and that has become first a classic of Gulag chanson and then a classic of Ruski chanson. So these texts actually somehow traveled. So I spoke very briefly about Kazarnovsky. Kazarnovsky had, as most of the people I spoke about, unfortunately, a very terrible fate. And his fate was, like others that were executed in 1937 and 38, was that he was rearrested a few times and eventually became either mad or a narcomaniac, or like he completely lost the plot. It seems like he was one of the last people to see Mandelstam alive. And so Nadezhda Mandelstam went to Kazarnovsky to try to gather information about what he had seen, but he could not make sense anymore. This happened in 1956 after Kazarnovsky was released. But Kazarnovsky, before becoming what eventually became, unfortunately, was this guy described by memoirists as a guy with an incredible memory that would constantly recite poems. So I assumed that in all the places where he went during the different stages of his detention, he would have said, taught the poems. Ginsburg herself was a person who had this role of being like what I call in a few things I wrote, the living book. The person who actually recites poems to the other prisoners, sometimes fellow prisoners, sometimes the criminals who use them for entertainment. So these texts did have circulation, which of course was not as wide as what would be a normal circulation of a book, but they did have some circulation within the camps. I don't know if that addresses Katie's point.
Katie, would you?
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. That is something really interesting to consider also, is the mobility of this literature and what kind of literature is mobile and how it really maybe creates a canon or a school of literature for the camps as well that reaches beyond just the circulation of these publications. Thank you.
Yeah, also because I want to add just quickly, actually, when you talk about this literature, you should probably get rid of the idea of literature as you know it. So there's not a book, usually it's something that's stored in the brain. It's stored, yes, exactly. And to be fair, I constantly wonder myself if the main problem is it literature? Like, to which point is literature, to which point is testimony, to which point is an attempt to survive, to remain. So, but I mean, this is another huge page, but it's not the written book. So it is a completely different type of phenomenon. And so the circulation is different.
Absolutely, thank you. We have no more questions in the chat, so unless anybody else wishes to sort of raise anything now, it is 7:30, so it is officially our finishing time. Thank you, Andrea, for a wonderful talk and for some fantastic questions. I think there was some really, really interesting issues came out in the questions and answers as well. So that has been, so I really enjoyed this. I thought it was wonderful. There is a recording being done, so that will be posted. And you will be able to sort of go back to it. I certainly know a couple of people who couldn't attend who will be very pleased there's a recording of this. Do visit the Beauty in Hell exhibition at the Hunterian. The Earl is right at the beginning of the chat. And yeah, thank you again. I'm still not getting quite...
Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me, and all the others for the great comments and questions. It was actually, it's not physical, but it was a fantastic moment of exchange. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, and I'm still not quite sure how we're supposed to do sort of rounds of applause, but we can do it, and you can do a...
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, and have a good evening, everyone.
I see people from Helsinki.